Okay, well, while we're waiting, Eli, why don't I pass it on to you just to talk to everyone about sort of the logistics and the security that we have in place and the recording and all that. And then maybe once you're done, we'll have Mike with us.
Okay, sounds good. Good morning, everyone. So just before we get started with the webinar, I just have a couple housekeeping items. So first, note on security. So in order to provide safe and secure virtual spaces, we've taken some measures to mitigate the risk of Zoom hacking. So we're using Zoom's dedicated webinar platform. And through this, all attendees are required to register in advance, and there's a password. And by default, all participants are view only. That being said, during the presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to click the raise hand button and we can unmute you, or you can type your question into the Q&A box, the function at the bottom of the screen, which will be monitored throughout the webinar, and questions will be put forward. That function also allows you to ask the question anonymously if you wish. And then after the presentation, we're going to open it up to a larger group discussion for everyone. So we'll go through and unmute everyone after Jane's done with the presentation, and you'll be able to ask questions as you wish. Just a disclaimer, this webinar is being recorded, so we can post it on our website and YouTube channel for everyone that was unable to attend. And finally, after the webinar, I'm going to be sending out a short survey. If you could please complete it, that'd be greatly appreciated. The webinar surveys provide us with really important feedback to ensure that we're delivering the best webinars possible. Thanks so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Marley.
Great. Thanks, Eli. So normally we would like to start the webinar off with a prayer and a blessing from one of our elders, but we are just waiting for our elder today, Mike Bruised-Head, to join us. So I'm going to kind of go out of line a little bit and just sort of introduce the webinar, let you guys know what we're going to be talking about today, and then hopefully once I am done giving an overview of the webinars and today's webinar specifically, we'll have Mike with us. I just want to be conscious of everybody's time. So yes, like I said, apologies for going out of order today. It's not normally how we would do things, but we're going to be a little bit adaptive today. So hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. I am Marley Kozak. I'm going to be your host and moderator for today's webinar. For those of you that don't know me, haven't joined in the past, I am a community-based monitoring program coordinator with the Government of Alberta. So I'm normally joining you all for the webinars from Edmonton, Alberta, but today I'm actually east in Toronto. I'm back home visiting my family for the holidays. So today's webinar is part of a larger monthly webinar series titled Keeping the Fire Burning. And these monthly webinars are being used as a platform for knowledge sharing and learning under an initiative that I'm involved in and my team is involved in, called Fire with Fire. So Fire with Fire is a multi-year collaborative initiative between the Resilience Institute, who are based out of Canmore, Alberta, the Resource Stewardship Division of Alberta Environment and Parks, and 4 Indigenous communities that we have partnered with in Alberta. So there's Kainai First Nation, Pagani First Nation, Samson Cree Nation, and Denijah First Nation. Fire with Fire, it's really working towards bringing together Indigenous and scientific understandings and knowledges of changing fire regimes. And the goal is that this will lead to new insights and innovative practices to enhance local, regional, and provincial climate change resilience. So there's 2 main areas of work to achieve this goal, and that's community capacity building. And we're really looking at different participatory methodologies for this capacity building, one of which is participatory video training. And then the other is actually knowledge sharing. And these webinars are part of the knowledge sharing activity. So today's webinar, Prescribed Burning in Canada, Part 2. Last month was Part 1, and we focused on prescribed burning specifically in Alberta. But today we're going to focus on Parks Canada's fire management policies and prescribed fire program in Canada's mountain national parks. This webinar is going to highlight the planning that's required the stakeholders that are involved, and the benefits that arrive from prescribed fire programs in Canada's national parks. So with that, I would like to, oh, I just want to see if we have, do we have Mike? I don't think so yet. Okay, well, with that, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Jane Park. So Jane is a fire and vegetation management specialist with Parks Canada. She has a really exciting and awesome bio, but I don't want to be the one to tell that all to you. So I'm actually going to give it over to Jane. So I'm sure she would do a much better job at introducing herself. But Jane, thank you for being here. I'm really excited. So I'm going to turn it over to you. And yeah, I think we'll just, if you're okay with being adaptable and flexible, depending on when Mike joins us, maybe we can have him do the blessing halfway through, or maybe he joins us at the end and we do it at the end to close. But yeah, just a forewarning that we might need to stop at some point.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'll just start with the screen sharing, and then if Mike joins in, you guys can just interrupt me and I'll definitely stop so we can proceed with the blessing. So as Marley indicated, I am the fire veg specialist for Banff. I wanted to first acknowledge that I'm talking today from Banff National Park, which is within the present-day territories of the Treaty 6, 7, 8 First Nations, as well as the Métis homeland, and to acknowledge the fact that these lands and waters of Banff have been used by for millennia by Indigenous peoples for sustenance, ceremony, trade, and travel. And we thank them for their continuous stewardship and sharing the land with us. In terms of myself, I started working for Parks Canada in 2002. A lot of my time has been spent in the mountains. I'm originally from Winnipeg, but I did spend some time up north in the Arctic at Banff National Park, which is a park that is co-managed with the Untitled First Nation, which means that no decisions within that park are made without the co-management of the First Nation there. And I also spent some time in Haida Gwaii at Gwaii National Park Reserve, where that park is co-managed with the Haida Nation. And so some of my experiences in those places shape kind of my experiences working with First Nations to basically steward the land together. And it's quite different in southern Canada. And so what we have in Banff are, you know, the numbered treaties, and some of that comes with some complicated relationships. But I'm really hoping that these types of initiatives and knowledge sharing can kind of put us in the right direction for the future, and kind of start building those relationships so that we can work together more into the future. So today, I'm going to chat with you mostly about our prescribed fire program, but just our fire management program in general, and how we're using fire to restore fire to the landscape. And in particular, I'm going to focus on how we use it to restore habitat for bison, for grizzly bears, and species at risk, but then kind of end the conversation on where we'd like to go into the future. So in terms of an overview, as I mentioned, I'll talk about how it's run in Banff in terms of policy and what our history is here of Parks Canada, the state of the forest, and how we use it to improve both wildlife habitat and forest resilience for climate change resilience. So our program is largely based on historic fire regimes. And for Parks Canada, we've always believed that, well, not always, I guess in our modern program, we have believed that the anthropogenic cultural burning by local Indigenous people is part of that natural fire regime. We have fire history studies that have indicated that there was fire outside of the typical lightning season, which really can only be explained by anthropogenic or cultural burning. And that's largely early and late season burning in the valley bottoms for various reasons of wildlife populations and travel routes and those types of things. But it also includes mixed severity fires, including large stand replacing fires started by lightning. So this image here that you see, it's a photo from the turn of the century up the Cascade Valley, just to the northeast of Banff, kind of the valley that feeds into Lake Minnewanka, if you've been here. And you can see that even though it's in black and white, you can see a lot of light areas that are all in the valleys, and that represents a lot of fire and a mosaic of different vegetation types. You can see that there are, you know, open stands, so a lot of the, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but down in the valley bottoms, it's quite a bit lighter. You can see where avalanche paths, another important disturbance process, has created differences in vegetation, and then you can still see stands of forest. And that diversity in habitat really supported or supports a large amount of our biodiversity in the park and in this ecoregion. If you fast forward, this photo was taken not very long ago, and you can see there have been some meadows maintained, some of the lighter green areas, but it's largely been infilled with forested stands. And that's a large part of the kind of last century of forest management, where fire suppression has been the predominant management strategy. The meadows you do see here in this photo have actually been maintained through prescribed fire, and I'll kind of go through the history of that in our program. So in Banff, as I mentioned in the land acknowledgement, there is this acknowledgement of cultural burning practices in this area all over North America, in fact. But in many places in North America and all over the world, around the 1700s and 1800s, people started to really feel the impacts. It's when colonizers started settling everywhere, and so they didn't want fires to burn their newly acquired or stolen agricultural lands. And so the forest fire laws were implemented in Canada. In 1883, they established Banff National Park, and by doing so, they excluded Indigenous cultural practices such as burning from this area. And they continued to prevent fires really effectively with all the new technology and pumps and vehicles and fire roads and fire lookouts really effectively through the early 1900s, straight through to the point where they basically eliminated fire from the landscape as a whole until the early 1980s. What precipitated that change was a very large fire in Kootenay National Park, the Vermilion Vermilion Pass fire, which you can still see when you drive into Kootenay National Park. You can see where it's a really, really dense lodgepole pine. And park managers started to realize that at first that they thought it was a devastating fire that, you know, would ruin everything. But then slowly they came to see that the ecosystem was resilient to fire, and that, you know, biodiversity increased and the plants did come back. It wasn't just this barren land. And so park managers started to kind of realize that, you know, fire wasn't necessarily this really negative process. And so in the 1980s, they started the prescribed fire program in Banff, a tiny little prescribed fire by Tujack Canal, 6 hectares. And since then, they've done numerous scientific studies to just further support the use of prescribed fire to restore fire to the land. And from 2000 till now, Banff National Park has had a target of restoring 50% of the historic fire cycle in Banff. And that includes kind of the fire cycle both in the valley bottoms, which is fairly frequent, anywhere from 10 to 50 years, all the way to the upper subalpine, which can extend, you know, 150 or more years. So this graph here shows only kind of since colonization happened in the park, the fire regime or the fire kind of pattern. And in the early 1900s, fire was maintained on the landscape primarily by escape fires from the railway. And so a lot of these larger fires represent the railway fires associated kind of with the railway pushing through the park. But then you can see from about 1940 onwards, there really was no fire at all. The one little blip in 1968 was that Vermilion fire I spoke to you guys about. And And then we start into the 80s where we started prescribed fire from the Parks Canada Fire Management Program. And it continues to kind of fluctuate. And largely over the last 20 years, we have been very close at hitting our 50% target. Obviously, that won't ever make up for the decades of fire suppression, but we are trying to restore fire to the landscape now. Our program is based around three kind of primary principles. Obviously, the first one is to protect the people and the critical infrastructure and adjacent lands. It is our first three priorities, I guess. The second is that fire is a natural and important part of our ecosystems here. We understand that most of our wildlife and plant species are adapted to fire. And lastly, that fire suppression has left a legacy of older closed forests, a loss of wildlife habitat, diversity, and increased risk of uncontrollable wildfires. And all of that is exacerbated these days by climate change as well. So our program, specifically in Banff, we tend to try to burn for multiple ecological objectives as well as public safety objectives. So trying to reimagine the landscape with more vegetation heterogeneity, increase wildlife habitat for a variety of wildlife, reduce wildfire risk to communities and critical infrastructure. And it works on multiple scales as well. So we operate at a landscape level, looking at kind of entire watersheds, and we burn from large stand replacing mixed severity fires, so crown fires included, to small scale meadow burning and hazard reduction burning. So it's developed into a fairly complex program. One of the key things that we've been doing lately is burning for bison. So bison were reintroduced to the park in 2017. And we recognize that both bison and fire are keystone processes. And that a keystone process is basically a process or an ecosystem component that is fundamental to the proper functioning of that ecosystem. And fire is a natural disturbance, and bison are a keystone species. They, with their wallows and their grazing, they reduce shrub and tree encroachment on meadow features. They modify the vegetation and fire behavior. So you can see in this photo, this actually isn't from Banff, but it was from a large wildfire in Wood Buffalo National Park. And you can see in the kind of middle bottom of the screen, a large bison wallow. And that you can see how clearly it has modified the vegetation in that area through their behavior. And so that's the kind of behavior that can maintain those meadows throughout Banff as well. They increase productivity and palatability of grasses just by grazing and encouraging growth. And also they convert that vegetation into protein, aka their bodies, for predators and scavengers as well. And that's a close-up of one of the wallows as well, you can see. So 16 bison were introduced from Elk Island National Park in 2017. It was a really big process and an accomplishment for the park. From 2017 till now, the current herd has grown to about 35 animals within the reintroduction zone. And our program, the fire program, has worked with the bison program to improve habitat quality throughout that reintroduction zone through meadow habitat maintenance. And so since the start of the project, we've restored over 2,100 hectares of meadow habitat, including 891 hectares just this last fall in 2020. So the Flint, Stoney, and Flint's Park prescribed fire, it actually overlaps that historic photo that I showed at the beginning, and it overlaps some previous prescribed fire. So what we were trying to do there is knock back the lodgepole pine saplings and seedlings and try to reestablish those native meadows and grasses in that area. It'll help to increase palatability, so we'll get rid of a lot of the coniferous seedlings and improve grass and forbs and shrubs. And they've shown a lot in science that fires will improve not necessarily quantity of grasses and shrubs, but the protein content. So the nutrients that go into the soil from burning actually increases the quality of the forage that exists there, and it helps to maintain those open meadows. Another wildlife species that we burn for is our grizzly bears. And what we do know about grizzly bears in Banff is that they have really slow population growth. They don't have salmon and really plentiful berries here. So they're often foraging roots and forbs and buffalo berries aren't nutrient rich. And so they have really slow population growth rate. And they have increased pressure due to mortality sinks that are associated with park use. So we've got the Trans-Canada Highway and the railway and increased human conflicts within the community. And so we did conduct a large study with a master's student from the U of A, Charlie McClellan, who's my counterpart in Lake Louise. And what he found in his study is that prescribed fires and wildfires improve forage habitat for grizzly bears. And the graph you see there is just the density of berries, both in burned and in thinned areas. I'll talk about fuel management in a bit here too. And the yellow is the treatment. So you can see how much more productive that habitat is following a prescribed fire, as well as the green herbaceous vegetation. So on the left of both of those charts are the burned areas, and you can see there's significant differences between controlled, so basically fire suppressed stands compared to burn stands. That project also helped create this map that shows kind of areas where prescribed fire will be most beneficial to bear forage. And through that project, we looked at collared grizzly bears, and it showed that bears have an affinity to burned areas. And one of the neatest examples of that was one of the grizzly bear female, productive females, her entire home range was the footprint of the 2003 Fairholme prescribed fire. We also have other grizzly bears that have primarily used our fire breaks, and their home ranges are similarly very overlapping with those treatments. It also shows that prescribed fire can improve and create bear habitat, both for spring foraging and pre-hibernation foraging. And this map just kind of shows the hotter areas are areas where prescribed fires will be beneficial, and the kind of dark red with black outline is where we've already implemented prescribed fires or there have been wildfires, and you can see that they overlap quite well. And so we're hoping by creating more bear habitat outside of these really populated areas like the town of Banff or the Trans-Canada Highway, we can reduce mortality in that species. The last example of kind of fire restoration and how it links to other ecosystem components is looking at a species at risk, the whitebark pine. So the whitebark pine is an endangered species. It is a 5-needle pine that grows at higher elevations. And it is dependent on fire to create openings for it to grow because it's shade intolerant. It's also totally dependent on nutcrackers, which are a bird that disperse their seeds and cache them in certain sites, and the seeds they forget turn into the trees that we see. And so by conducting prescribed fires, we can ensure that there's adequate regeneration habitat for whitebark pine. They're also negatively affected by fire in that all the dense forests that have grown since fire suppression can obviously get to be really intense and severe fires that kill individual trees as well. And the last component of that is that the whitebark pine is threatened by introduced European white pine blister rust that kills whitebark pine. And so we do, for restoration purposes and recovery of the species, we plant blister rust resistant seedlings. So over the last 30 or 35 years, the Sawback, which is adjacent to the Bow Valley Parkway in the park, if people have been there, it has been burnt upwards of 11 different times in different locations. It had been totally infilled by dense spruce and pine forests, and so now with our latest iteration of burning there in 2014, we've kind of restored the Douglas fir and aspen grasslands that would have been there prior to the park being established. And in doing so, we also created some additional whitebark pine regeneration habitat. So in that fire, there were mature, healthy stands of whitebark pine up high. We burnt it in the fall when those areas were had higher moisture, and so we were able to not burn any of the existing trees, but then we also followed up with some planting. So the one thing to note here is that, you know, obviously some of these projects are really complicated. This one was adjacent to the Trans-Canada Highway and the 1A Parkway. We burnt it actually on the Friday of a long weekend, which, if you can imagine, the tourist season is something we have to work around here in terms of management's comfort level. But we had really good conditions. So we had 2 weeks of drying conditions followed by incoming rain and snow. And in fact, within kind of 36 hours of this prescribed fire, we had a blanket of snow, and we had very little mop up to do. And you can also see, you know, this is only about 5 kilometers upwind of the town of Banff. And we had really good venting conditions. So we conduct our prescribed fires using prescriptions for wind and venting so that we can minimize impacts to local communities. And, you know, I've lived in Banff for the last almost 30 years now. And they basically, hardly anybody in town even know we had conducted this burn because none of the smoke went into town. So some of our results, you know, like I said, we're trying to restore those meadows where we have better diversity. So you can see pre and post burn density of coniferous seedlings and saplings. And so we significantly reduced those across the unit. And then in 2017, we planted 500 rust-resistant seedlings of whitebark pine in that area as well. And so far, by and large, those have been doing really well. The other part that ties into the grizzly bear picture is that following, you know, the first iteration of prescribed fire, you always get a whole bunch of coarse woody debris that really affects the movement of wildlife throughout the area. And so we also were able to reduce the coarse woody debris that kind of acts like pickup sticks in the area significantly post-fire with good consumption. So that all goes to speak to the prescriptions under which we burn these, what I would call modified habitats that are a result of suppression. So, yep.
Sorry, I'm just gonna interrupt you really quickly. We do have Elder Mike Brewsted on the line.
Sure.
So I'm going to invite Mike to come on and do his blessing. I know he's, you know, he can't stay for the whole time, so I do apologize for cutting you off. But like I said, I do want to introduce Mike and give him the opportunity to give the prayer. So Mike, can you hear me, Mike? Or Eli, I don't know if maybe you need to unmute Mike.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Mike. Yes,
Hello.
we can. How are you?
Oh, yeah, good morning. Okay, itamix ka na ito nisto na ko ka ninapik sin iksumatsitsip nitamukos na katsumoy ka. Good morning. I can't see anybody. I was supposed to be on Zoom this morning. My wife had chest pains and ran her into Lethbridge Regional Hospital. But before we did that, we prayed in the smudge of sweetgrass. And so I prayed for her. And I just want to continue with that prayer. She's doing all right. A little bit of a pain on the left side under her left arm, but now it's going away. So I guess I'll start on that and maybe say a few words. But before I pray, you know, sometimes as humans, we forget about ourselves, you know, and you know, and again, we're just little bitty things on this earth. And just hearing the presenter on fire, I like to speak to that after I pray. So I want to pray for all of you. And I don't know if Zoom is going to be the way of the future in meeting. We save costs and governments, NGOs, funding just being very short. But hopefully we can all see each other in person. I've heard of this institute. I've been reading the material. and from the kind of Ecosystem Protection Association perspective. Keep on. Hopefully, June we'll have our supposedly 8th annual. We didn't have one, so this would have been our 9th. So it's going to be our 8th annual environmental summit. So I would like to pray for all of you in times of COVID in the indigenous community, and I'm not going to hide it under the rug. I don't know why we're being attacked from outsiders selling very bad drugs to our young people. We're not manufacturing it here. We're not the place of distribution, but it's coming on by outsiders as if they're just jumping on the young people, you know, and that's a sad thing. So I want to pray for all of you and for the holiday season coming up, our kids, grandkids, and yourselves. And, you know, that's the first thing they asked us if we had COVID at the emergency. We said no, and then all the protocols for safety, everything. So we're okay. We're negative, but I hear just right next door there might be some people that are just being brought in that are positive. That's how close it is, and we're right at the hospital. So let me say a prayer in my language. It is Blackfoot. I don't know how many participants. I wish I was on Zoom. I'm away from my computer, so I will say a prayer in my Blackfoot language to help all of you, even myself and my wife Barb. Heart conditions run in our families. Sherry lost 3 brothers to heart attacks, you know, and she's the youngest in her family, you know. So getting a drink of water here. Okay, so I will begin my prayer, and I want to just say a few words regarding fire and the Kino fire that I'm aware of most recently. I will begin now. Ayaw na pinatos. Ay nakanato ito pinokkain sikat sumata kakanag istikui ka kitokat sin sikat sumatok pinnan. Lokat sikak sikoksak kinnanak. Ispomosak. Iskanakak, nukapwa, okanak, nanukamukak, upitam, oksis tunikak, uskakskak, ikokatakak sukui. Ispomos, okmuk snapi, kak snapiakiks. Asa kukito man staksikka, ika kimatupinan, hindi kanaksikka napi, and iksakoisit kita patapiwas pinan. Anakani sokkatsyak, kanamyan stipiksyo. Actually, I insteek suukwamman. Ayaw kagis pumukinan na kimukinan is chupatapil. Ani kag suka pi kag siguk ka pakaman stupnan. Og nakita mo stum katuik stikum finan. Isa po ka tupinan ni kagis tuika. Gyogan kis kanatunin. Nipitama kuks aksa tapitsista. Aksa po ka tuman ni kag uskitsep. Piak katsitama. Nakukatita mo pa tupinan no kunanan ka. Kyogas ko kita am stupinan no kusanak nesukosang. Og ni tiskuna nagsiksikay sa tapilkana, siksikay skypikani, pinapikani. Og nagit stop ya kada pisku sikokutuke. Muhkinstase og kikagins kmistaki smuksita po takikskak. Knasuka pinas kukutotat simutis pinan. Kemukinan is chapatapil. O keniksuka pigikons papakaman skitsiyoktok pinakis kanatani edsgetan staikakim. Nokstakato si tamatosiman. Ako kutsapo katum ni pitaman ni kagiskitsaktis kanatani. O kenigirkons tapakaman stupinanis chapatapil. Kemukinan, espomokinan. O kenikmisami patapilsen. Sastawatsaman kemmapipitsunikak. Thank you. I just want to say a few words, and I got to get back into the observation emergency area at the Lethbridge Regional Hospital. I just wanted to say something here. I've been asked, you know, way back, 10, 12, 50,000 years ago, and a lot of our elders, in fact, all of them don't believe in the Bering Strait, which is always the first page I open when I open geography and environmental books, the ice, the bridge, and all that. I just want to park that or put it way on the side. We don't believe in that because of our point of origin and creation stories. And I teach for University of Calgary a master's in education, several courses. And, you know, I do ceremonies. And the connection to ceremony is a point of origin. And so I just want to park that kind of thinking, academic, colonial type thinking. You know, whoever invented that, it's really good thought. And I'm impressed to say the least, but that's where it stops. When the Keno fire went through close to the Bellevue Trail, just going towards Red Rock Canyon, where the prairies meet the mountains. That Escarine there, Elliot Fox knows about this. Anyways, we were sitting there, and the markers for our studying the plants, invasive plants, and the aspen stands, the markers, the little rods we put in there. Well, we found them, and we had them about maybe a foot out of the ground. And so when we uncovered the aspen end of the rods, the markers there, they're a little bit over 2 feet sticking out. And so a foot or more of the grass and the dirt uncovered, blew away. Could be 8,000–10,000 years of that gathering. And we uncovered the natural grasses. And the natural grasses that were, I guess, subservient in a way to the aggressive invasive species of plants, grasses, and even the aspen. And I found that very interesting. A group of us sitting there and thinking, wow, we put this in last year or 2 years ago, and the trees burnt down through the Keno fire that started from British Columbia. I guess worldwide, I said, you know, all these bluegrass and different types of grasses and plants, you know, and I just forget the word when something blows in the air and they land there, and the impact, you know, it's interesting, you know, how the wind currents, if they've carried these, and I keep things, well, things could be carried from China across the Pacific Ocean or from California and the jet streams coming up this way. I often wonder if the air currents have also switched up a bit to find these kind of plants that are alien, that are invasive and very aggressive, to take over the natural plants. And right now I'm just kind of hitting I don't really say Waterton Lakes because I'm advocating that the Blackfoot word be used for the sacred lake between two layers of mountain, you know, and it has a long story. The point I'm making, I talked to some elders through this whole fire thing, and I heard 2 or 3 things. That the lightning knows when to hit a ground to start a fire. That the lightning, because we have bundle ceremonies that honors the medicine pipe bundles, that we cannot dictate the natural causes of prairie and mountain type fires. The thunder will decide that. It puts a whole different thought in how we've all been taught, you know, that thinking. And we're talking Blackfoot, and I don't want to use the word science, but I'll need stapiocucks and Blackfoot knowledge. I wanted to share that the lightning is more the cause of fires, that the lightning will find an area that will create this. And then I talked to the elders. Yes, a few times we created. It was kind of like, we do not play with fire. We do not create it just for the sake of creating it. But at times when it happens, and I asked them, okay, when is it good to start a fire? And they said, you know, sometimes animals, you know, when they die and rot because they're diseased, it's best their carcasses are burned. I told him, what about the buffalo? He said, yes, sometimes the old stories, the elk, the transmission of different diseases among them, that when they die and we need to clear up the carcasses and the bones. And then I heard a third one. Well, what about the buffalo jumps? He said, you know, they said when buffalo are stampeded and trampled, they kill the grass, the top layer. And sometimes fires will follow the buffalo heading towards the buffalo jump because they're massive, and the grass needs to regrow. And so I heard those three stories, and I told him, okay, what about this fire in the Keno? And I said, I've talked to some of the Waterton Parks officials way out by, they're on the other side of South Kootenai Pass, Sage Pass, on the other side of the Continental Divide, and that they actually saw the fire. And I said, yeah, it's very interesting that the fire started on the west side and came over the east, and the wind currents and the wind just kind of pushing it. It almost had a mind of its own. And the elders said, you know, we haven't even begun to understand how nature works on its own. When the earth wants to do something, and the clouds and the wind and the thunder and the sun, they will do it. They will do it. And they said, that is why we offer tobacco to the ground and feed the ground the sacred berries, is to give thanks to the Creator, give thanks to the earth, that good things. So it wasn't like they frowned upon the fire, but they explained the process that why. And they said, we're not surprised that the Keno started. We were wondering when that was going to happen, you know. And they said it was this side of the mountains turn. And I thought, wow, this side of the mountains turn. He said, there's always been forest fires in the Rocky Mountain, me stuck east, but the lightning will search where it's going to start. And so I find that really interesting. It might throw modern studies kind of to the parked on the wayside and think about it, how lightning starts fires. So today we have controlled fires. We are the lightning, but at the same time, you know, it's not a question of what's ethical, but what's proper in terms of for the earth. And so those I wanted to share about fire. They've always been around, will be around a lot longer than all of us here put together. But to think about from a Blackfoot eyes, fire. Why fire? The fire, the lightning, the fire, the wind, they all have a job to do. And so I asked a question talking about grizzly bears. And they said, you know, if people were on the ball, they will look at the birds. The birds are the first messengers. Once they start sitting on the tree, and then they move out of the way, 20, 30 to a tree. and the insects that fly, if they start flying out of that area, that the four-leggeds look at the birds, and the four-leggeds will think, something is up. Something is up, you know. So even that phenomena of animals and the bird life, everything, insects, reptiles, warning each other. And I asked, what about the burrowing animals? They said they will dig their dens deeper if they sense something is in the air, literally in the sky. And so these are the old people talking that the animals are wise, but sometimes when I don't know if the animal world is changing because of the encroachment of human beings into their domestic territories, that they kind of put their guard down. And like the elder said, when a bear sees a human, just once a bear sees it, they comprehend, okay, that's a different species, that human being. So like how we see a bear, it kind of makes us think different. Well, likewise, a bear, when they see humans, they think different. And sometimes, you know, when there's a lot of people in the parks, in a certain area, it pushes the animals a little bit deeper into the valleys, into the mountains, and they're almost pushed into a line of fire. And if there's no human beings, there'll be actually where there's settlement, the bears would have been there anyways. That's their home, but we've come along. And so I just wanted to share that with you. You know, I sat a lot of elders, just the whole thing, because I was asked, did the Blackfoot people have fire conservancy? Did they have a plan? Well, it wasn't like where it was, okay, well, we'll go 40 meters or 40 kilometers to no. If it was needed. Other than that, it was left to the lightning to clean that area. And so the closing comment, lightning is a cleansing thing to the earth. And the elder said, we should not be angry. We should not be upset. The fire has a job, and eventually the rain comes back and there's new growth to the area. And so I found that very interesting. And I've encouraged the young people really gather the different things. You worked here 2-3 years gathering data on the invasive species in Waterton. What we're learning when they're foot and a half of the dirt underneath where you find the natural grasses. That was most amazing and rewarding when we found where it burnt, that the natural grass were able to breathe, so to speak, and grow before the invasive, aggressive species kind of almost smothered them. And I was thinking, wow, is that 10,000-year-old grass, 8,000-year-old grass? That is amazing. So I just want to share that with you, all of you. I don't even know how many are on this Zoom. My full apologies. My wife will be all right. She was pretty scared, and I just prayed, you know. And the machines are working in there. They're okay. They'll just kind of do some more tests. Heart disease runs in their family. She's lost three brothers to heart attacks, and their youngest brother died at the age of 49. So it runs in their family, and I told them, no, we'll be all right. I believe in this Chipata, that I believe in our Creator. So thank you for listening to me. I don't know who's chairing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. This is Elliot. Thank you very much, and we're praying for Barb.
Mhm.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you for the blessing and also for sharing with us your knowledge and your teachings today, especially around fire. It was a really nice addition to the presentation that Jane is giving us. And like Elliot said, there's about 30 of us on this webinar, and on behalf of all of us, we're sending your wife, positive wishes for a speedy recovery, and for yourself and your family and your community to stay safe during this, crazy time of COVID. And yeah, just thank you so much for joining us. It was really nice to have you and to hear from you again.
Yeah. Well, how long is this this meeting or this session? How long is it?
We have about 30 minutes left.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I thought it went into the afternoon, then I could join you guys, but maybe next time. Thank you for allowing me to pray and for listening to me. I really appreciate it. Thank you, and I'll head back I'm sitting in my truck right now.
Well, thank you so much for stepping outside for the time, and like I said, giving us a blessing and teachings and knowledge. It's very appreciated. So thank you so much.
Can I just leave everybody with my old Hotmail, chiefbird@hotmail.com. If somebody wants to talk later or connect, chiefbird@hotmail.com, all lowercasing.
Perfect. And Mike, this is Marley speaking. I know you can't see, but I actually have your email, so I can share that with the attendees. I'll type it in the chat, so that way everyone has it. Has it written, and they can copy it down and get a hold of you.
All right, thank you, Marley. All right, thank you so much. Thank you. I'm going to be disconnecting, and you guys have a good session. Thank you.
Thank you. Talk
All
later.
right, goodbye. Yeah, bye.
Okay. All right. Well, that was lovely. It's always nice to hear from Mike. He always has so much wisdom and knowledge and teachings and stories to share. I always feel so honored when Mike joins us. But yeah, I will turn it over to you again, Jane, to finish your presentation.
Thanks, Marley. I'm just going to share my screen. But while I do that, that was actually probably a pretty good time for Mike to actually interject. I think the next little bit, the last bit of my presentation kind of will marry really well with the things that Mike said. So I really appreciate him being able to talk today. And I'm really hoping that I get another chance to chat with him more once he's through this stressful time with his family. Can everybody see my presentation again? Did I do that right? Hopefully. Okay, so.
Yeah, sorry, it looks good. I was just trying to unmute myself, but everything looks good on my end, yeah.
Okay, great. So I kind of went through some of the kind of examples of how we can use prescribed fire to kind of rectify what's happened in the last 100 years, and I'm going to talk about a few other things and what we will do into the future. But basically, introducing fire back to the landscape helps us with forest resilience into the next period of climate change by introducing heterogeneity, improving wildlife habitat and biodiversity, just like both Mike said and some of the examples I gave earlier. It also makes the forest more resilient to forest insects and disease. So, if you can imagine mountain pine beetles, those are native insects that are meant to be on our landscapes. But kind of our man-made landscape of large continuous tracts of mature forests has kind of given them like a buffet of food to increase their populations to kind of less sustainable sizes, so that they end up decreasing biodiversity because they cause large-scale mortality, like you see in a lot of places like BC and Jasper. Wildfire risk mitigation, we can't ignore the fact there are people on the landscape now, and communities and critical infrastructure requires some work to make it more resilient to potential future wildfires, or even to sustain the natural fire regime. So we want to introduce fire to the landscape to reduce some of those impacts to public safety and the economy, as well as the ecosystem. So the map you see there is just a very simple map of green stands that are less than 150 years old and older stands that are over 150 years old. And in the past, you know, when, as Mike spoke to, when lightning and the bits of cultural burning occupied the landscape, you would have seen a whole lot more of a mosaic of young and old stands, where we see a lot of red on this map. Our goal with our prescribed fire and fire management program is to kind of restore a lot of the younger forests that sustain a lot of our wildlife. And so you'll have to squint a little bit, but I'm just going to flip the slide and you'll see the areas of green kind of grow. And those are all the prescribed fires that we have planned for the Banff area, as well as a few that we are going to partner with Alberta on. And all that to say that it takes a lot of planning. So you'll see in the next few slides that we are wanting lightning to do its natural thing. That is the easiest way to get wildfire back onto the landscape. And these prescribed fires we do take a lot of planning. So just to meet our 50% goal of restoring the fire cycle, we have to plan many multitudes of more prescribed fire to be able to achieve any of that, because we're always waiting for the right weather conditions to conduct the fires so that we, you know, get the right ecological effects. And so we have to plan, you know, right now for the next 10 years, we have tentatively over 66,000 hectares of prescribed fire plan for the next 10 years, just to try to meet that 50% target. And it's, you know, it's probably not likely that we'll restore more than 50%, even though we plan that much. It takes up to 2 years of paperwork and approvals and consultation and all sorts of things to get these fires on the ground. It takes resources, and then you can sit there and wait for a decade for the right weather conditions. So prescribed fires are difficult to implement, especially at kind of a large scale. And so whenever possible, as Mike alluded to, we want to use the natural process of fire, so lightning fires, to restore that to the landscape. So our goal within Banff National Park and the mountain parks is to make it possible for lightning to restore fire to the landscape as much as possible. So we have a zoning practice within our parks. The green in the map there are the places where pretty much largely we can allow fire to take its natural role in the ecosystem. Obviously, we will still have some management to protect people and infrastructure, but largely we can allow fire to play out in those places as long as it falls within kind of what was natural in that region. You know, by doing this, we can reduce risks to our neighboring jurisdictions. So the provincial lands where there are more economic values. We can use strategic ignition to bring those wildfires to natural features so that we don't have to worry about adjacent values or land bases. And we've done so in the last few years quite a bit. So we've managed natural occurring wildfires in the North Saskatchewan Valley with the Spreading Creek Fire, which was over 1,800 hectares within the park, the Snarl Peak Fire in the Clearwater Valley, which is about 700 hectares, and certain portions of the Verdant Creek Fire in 2017, which was 18,000 hectares between Kootenay National Park and Mount Assiniboine Provincial Park in BC. And so, as Mike alluded to, the lightning, you know, it is part of our natural fire regime, and so we don't want to hinder that as much as possible because implementing prescribed fires is quite difficult. So there's a photo of the Spreading Creek Fire in 2014, Snarl Peak Wildfire in 2015, and the Clearwater in Banff. And then, you know, in addition to all those things that make prescribed fire difficult, the big challenge is that, you know, there's lots of research that shows wildfire smoke is hazardous to human health. We've experienced in the Bow Valley and in Calgary and southern Alberta multiple really long wildfire events with heavy smoke that has impacted human health. We are the unfortunate recipients of smoke from BC, northern Alberta, the Yukon, NWT, Montana, California, Idaho. We're just unfortunately located where all that smoke goes because of the prevailing winds. And so to reintroduce fire, we need to be cognizant that smoke impacts are really important to human health. And so public support is paramount. So understanding that with prescribed fires, we can control kind of where the smoke goes and the duration. You know, if we burn ahead of snow or rain, we limit the amount of smoke we put into the atmosphere. But we have, you know, 4 million visitors a year in our park. And so we have to balance that and those needs and the economic impacts of those visitors with restoration of this process. We work with Alberta Health and with the Calgary Regional Airshed Zone in terms of communicating about health effects of smoke and where people can find information on health advisories. We work with the tourism industry and obviously our park management in terms of impacts to those economic values. There are aesthetics values, you know, trying to teach the visitors and the residents of these areas that fire is a natural process, that, you know, things like the Kino fire, that wasn't necessarily outside of the range of historic fire regimes. It was a large fire relative to the tiny protected area that Waterton National Park is in that landscape. So we've done things to improve education and outreach. So we have a fire communications officer. We put out a lot on social media about the natural role of fire. We do consultation and engagement, and we participate in social science. And when we can't use fire, because there are people everywhere, you know, we conduct fuel management. So we acknowledge that there are the town of Banff, and we have visitors and infrastructure. So we use fuel management to facilitate landscape prescribed fire or managed wildfire. And a couple examples of those are the Carrot Creek Fire Guard. So in that map where I've put the green are existing, already implemented fuel management areas. The yellow are proposed fuel management areas. And we're doing that so that if a fire does occur upwind of the town of Banff, we might not have to fully suppress it. Maybe we can let lightning play its natural role, or we can implement prescribed fire. We work with scientists from the Canadian Forest Service to model wildfire risks so that it helps us to really focus our energy where we need it the most. And so we're doing that across the national parks where we have communities, and it can really help prioritize the maintenance and implementation of fuel treatments as well as prescribed fires. And I'll just close off the last couple slides here with our new fire management plan. This one was different in that we used a 3-park approach, so that our fire management plan is for Banff, Kootenay, and Yoho National Parks, because we recognize that fire doesn't really adhere to boundaries. And so we tried to make it as large of a landscape unit as we could. We also went to full public and Indigenous consultations. So you can see the list of Indigenous nations that we consulted with, because we did cross both the BC and Alberta boundaries, and we met with many of these nations in person, and when not able to meet in person, through writing. And we've tried to start building relationships with all the nations that we spoke to find better frameworks and protocols to work with Indigenous people. You know, some of those studies that Mike referred to, you know, incorporating Indigenous traditional knowledge and research, you know, trying to engage and look for new opportunities, whether that's, you know, financial through contracting, trying to integrate, talking to all the nations during the planning process, collaborating, and sharing the flame. So incorporating that traditional knowledge, what is allowed to be shared into the fire management program. So it's not just a federal government perspective, that we can include the values that are allowed to be shared with us and integrate those into the planning process and early into the planning process so that it's meaningful. So just to conclude, you know, Parks Canada will continue to burn for multiple objectives and use both prescribed fire and managed fire to create more resilient forests. And when it's too complicated for fire, we'll try to use fuel management to facilitate landscape fire management, and use science and new technologies and modeling to help prioritize implementation. And we continue, and I really strongly hope that we can initiate further work with Indigenous nations to better integrate cultural values into the program and further build relationships that we can take into the future. And that's all. So my email is there. I can take any questions now as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jane. That was amazing. Very interesting, really educational. I know that I learned a lot. So I'd like to open it up to the webinar participants to go ahead and ask questions. I think if you, and I always get this a bit mixed up. So Eli, I'll look to you if I say this wrong, but I think if you sort of just raise your hand, which I believe you can do at the bottom of the screen, then Eli can actually unmute you, and then you can ask your question directly versus writing into the chat box and then me reading it back to Jane. Is that?
So everyone should be unmuted, or should be allowed to unmute now if they have a question.
Oh, so they can just unmute themselves. Okay, perfect.
Any questions? Hopefully.
Hi, Jane. It's Neil from Alberta. Thanks for the presentation. Just wondering if your fire management plan is publicly available.
Yeah, the fire management plan is available. I believe the only one that's on the internet at the moment is the draft that went out for consultation. But if anybody wants a copy, I can send a PDF. My email, Marley and Eli have that, so it can be distributed to this group, and I'll send that out. I'm not sure exactly when the actual fully signed off fire management plan will hit the web, but yeah, I can definitely send it out.
Great, thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Neil.
Leslie, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, hi, it's Leslie from Alberta Indigenous Relations. I was interested in the What We Heard report, actually, and whether that was something that we could get a copy of, because having met Mike at the Keepa Summit #5, I was really interested in what he had to say, and I'm interested in how you would incorporate cultural values into your planning. So just let me know if it's something I can distribute like internally. Just, I'm looking for examples of how you incorporate the cultural values. Thanks.
Sure, yeah. The What We Heard document, I just have to check if it's totally finalized, because that comes after the approval of the fire management plan. So I'll double check. I'm going to admit right away that it's going to be disappointing, the What We Heard document, because it's very brief. It just largely covers the high level kind of points of what we heard. We are still in the process of trying to come up with a framework for Indigenous engagement and incorporation of values into our program. So, what we heard clearly, and this probably level of detail won't be there, is what we heard clearly is that they want, like all the nations we talked about, do want to be more involved in the planning and implementation of prescribed fire or fire management in the parks. One of our recent large fuel reduction projects, we had consultation with the nations for the West Sulphur Fuel Management Project, and it was really meaningful. I was able to meet elders from the Treaty 7 nations and the Blackfoot Confederacy and folks from the Métis Nation of Alberta and visit the site, and it was a bit of a difference for me in terms of our program and being able to actually connect with people on the ground. Obviously that's not able to happen this year because of COVID, but I'm really hoping that type of work and collaboration and relationship building can continue with our future projects. So, unfortunately, like, I can definitely look into sending the What We Heard document and the fire management plan around, but the intent was almost to leave it really open so that the input from the nations on how they want to be engaged and where they want to be involved is really largely up to both them and the program to talk and build those relationships and figure it out. What we didn't want was for us as Parks Canada to prescribe the framework directly and just like kind of lay it on everybody. And so we're very early in kind of implementation of the fire management plan and how that'll work, but I'm really hoping that we will make a real difference. So by the next fire management plan, we have a plan that everybody can can point to show what we're doing.
Okay, thanks, Jane.
Any
How
other questions?
frequently does Parks Canada go back and review the fire management plan?
So the fire management plan is intended to be a 10-year planning document. Most of our plans within Parks Canada are 10-year documents. However, the prescribed fire portion of the fire management plan, prescribed fire and fuel management, is a 5-year kind of cycle. So every 5 years we review what prescribed fires and fuel management kind of projects we intend to do and kind of refresh those.
Awesome. So then I would assume that every sort of 5 years, there would be new opportunities for like Indigenous communities to be involved in the sort of planning and implementation part of that prescribed fire program then.
I think the intent actually will be, or this is my intent, would actually be to engage almost annually. So every year we're adding prescribed fire, like, you know, we're taking the map that turned from red and green to more green. And every year we're picking some of those blobs to dive into the planning. And so the hope is that early in the conceptual planning of each of those prescribed fires, we would be engaging nations in, you know, the same way we do with our provincial stakeholders and that sort of thing, as to, you know, what our objectives are, what values there are, how they want to be involved, if they want to be involved, that sort of thing. So we haven't figured out exactly how that's going to work. We're batting around a few different potential options to pitch, but yeah, the intent would be shorter kind of cycle than the 5 years or the 10 years. So.
Awesome, thanks.
Any other questions? No?
I just have a question about sort of the logistics of burning. So you talked about like you talked about prescribed fires that you've done in the past, and I'm curious about, let's say you had a fire burned for, you know, the weekend of June 6th in 2021. What would be maybe some of the reasons that a prescribed fire would be postponed?
So we generally, I mean, it's really hard to target when we burn. So generally we don't we just say spring or fall essentially. And then we have like a list of actual parameters that are within the prescribed fire prescription. But generally, I mean, the most common reason to postpone a fire is weather. So our prescriptions detail the fuel moisture and the weather conditions and the smoke and venting conditions that we need to achieve the fire effects we want. So, you know, a fire isn't a fire. It has to be exactly what we want for, you know, so that we don't damage soil, or we don't, you know, we don't want to kill nesting birds. Like, there are a lot of things that we know about the ecosystem and how fire interacts. There's been a lot of research and knowledge about that shared over the years. So it really depends on really specific fuel and weather conditions. So that's the most common one. We're getting better because we have done prescribed fire for the last 35 years or more at knowing what conditions we need, and so we can look at how realistic it is. The other thing is, you know, I'm not gonna lie, there's politics and tourism and economics that do play into all of these things. Resourcing can also influence that. So, you know, in Parks Canada, we're a fairly small fire program. So the people, I mean, and it's the same across Canada, but the people fighting the giant wildfires are the same people lighting the prescribed fires. So if there's a big fire year in BC and we're all shipped off to a different park or a different province, there's nobody left at home to conduct fires at home. And so there's kind of a lot of different things that go into getting it done, which then means it is difficult to get a lot of these off the ground, especially the more complicated ones that are in the front country adjacent to infrastructure. You know, our program in Banff, as a result of my predecessor, Ian Pengelly, has been able to conduct really complicated prescribed fires like the Fairholme just upwind of Canmore in 2003. And it probably remains one of the only programs in North America that does prescribed fire stand replacing, so crown fire, prescribed fire in North America. And the Fairholme is actually used a lot in various presentations and courses to show how complicated prescribed fires can be done, but that was no small feat. It was probably, you know, an average prescribed fire takes 2 years to plan. That one probably was, you know, 10 years to plan, and the pinnacle of Ian's career before he retired. But yeah, it's not easy, and that's why, you know, if we can make the landscape more resilient and we're able to use lightning where it occurs, it's a lot easier. Because as Mike said, lightning knows when fires will burn, or the land knows when lightning will cause it to burn. And so we can use that to our advantage. But if we don't have fuel breaks or structure protection or emergency response plans in place to make sure that happens safely, then it becomes really difficult. Or if we don't break up the landscape and ensure that, you know, an entire watershed won't burn now because we've never had fire for 100 years, you know, we'll end up with longer lasting effects than what would have happened in the past. So.
Hi, Jane. This is Elliot. Yeah, thanks. That was really good information. I just have a question on the timing of your prescribed burns. Like, I've worked in Waterton for a number of years, you know, before the Keystones fire, and they used to always do their burns in the spring. So I guess the question I have is, are any of your prescribed burns planned outside of spring, like in summer, fall, or winter?
Yeah, so a lot, it really depends again on the kind of objectives. In the spring, the benefit of burning in the spring is obviously like after the snowfall, there's a lot of moisture in the ground. So when we want to burn for native grasses like fescue, which is a big one down in Waterton, those things, if you burn it in the fall or the summer, you'll burn all the rhizomes and you'll actually prevent it from coming back. You'll just, what I say, like you just nuke those rhizomes and you won't have the native grasses coming back. So we do a lot of spring burning. Where we tend to burn outside of spring is in the fall, when we're trying to, you know, we've kind of created this almost artificial ecosystem of like huge tracts of lodgepole pine forests, and those forests really only burn when it's quite warm and dry. And we've now have more lodgepole pine forests than we have grasslands, which would have otherwise been here and support a lot of our wildlife. So when we're trying to burn those lodgepole pine forests to get it back to grass, we tend to try to burn those in late fall, late summer, fall, because otherwise, you know, you burn the understory and you don't burn the trees, and then you don't have any increase in biodiversity. So so those tend to be the ones that we aim for the fall. But we can, you know, if we you know, we're looking at the weather every single day of the summer, and this summer in that one that we burned in the Cascade Valley, we had quite a bit of rain and stuff leading up to that, but then we got some really nice drying. So the soils were actually fairly, you know, moist enough that we didn't think we were going to damage the soil or the native grasses. But then as the grass is cured in the fall and get dry, then we targeted it when the grass was dry, the soil had enough moisture, so we didn't nuke it. So you can kind of play with the prescription and the timing to ensure that you don't damage some of those really important features. And I think like understanding more about what values the plants and animals, and if there's medicinal plants, then we can, you know, probably work together a bit more to understand like what else we need to protect. Because, you know, we have a very specific view in Parks Canada of ecosystem components, but we are missing kind of that additional cultural value of what else might be important. So.
Thank you.
Actually, Elliot, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot just a little bit, I know that you're really involved with KEPA, so the Kainai Ecosystem Protection Association. And I know there's sort of been quite a bit of talk over the past years with KEPA and talking about sort of bringing back fire. And I know you guys are working with bison and buffalo a lot. And so I'm just curious if you have anything to share maybe about KEPA or kyanized plans for prescribed burning or cultural burning at the moment. And if not, then that's okay. I just thought it might be interesting to hear sort of what a community's doing.
Yeah, okay. Good question, Marley. Thank you. Well, in terms of the larger blood reserve out on the prairie, we're actually looking at so for those that aren't aware, we've been working on what's transpired to be called the Kainai ENE, which is Buffalo Holistic Management Plan. So we've developed that over the past year, and so we're what it's I guess what we're calling it is a ENE, or bison rematriation. We were calling it a repatriation, but rematriation is probably describes what we're trying to do best. So we're getting 30 to 50 head of bison in late February from Elk Island. So they've been gone for over 140 years from this part of the prairies. So we're going to be bringing those back in February. And we're looking at some prescribed burns on that grassland, which is just southwest of Lethbridge, probably 10 kilometers. And that particular prairie is mixed grass. Further in the south of the reserve, we've got fescue. So we're looking at doing some prescribed burning there. And also we've got about a 7.5 square mile or 5,000 acre tract of timberland surrounded by Waterton on 3 sides in the Upper Belly River. So we're looking at possibly working with Waterton to do some prescribed burning on that piece of land, because there's been a lot of aspen, like Jane mentioned, that's encroached on what was historically prairie. So we're going to work with Waterton to see if we can do some prescribed burning on our timber area, just to bring back some of the native prairie. So yeah, so that's, I guess, I don't know if that answers your question, Marley, but
yeah.
Those are some of the things we're trying to do. We're also working on a whole bunch of projects with Waterton and Alberta Environment and Parks and the Resilience Institute and others on just monitoring our land better. There's our Kanzi Fox and her staff with the Blood Tribe Land Management Department are working on quite a few projects. We're restoring some native prairie in the south part of the reserve that was historically fescue. It was cultivated, so the land occupant is restoring that cultivated land back to prairie. So it's going to take a while. So we've been working on that, harvesting native grass seed from nearby and reseeding his land to try to bring it back to the native fescue. We're also doing work on amphibians and trout. Yeah, we may be reintroducing leopard frogs with Waterton on our timber area, and maybe the main reserve out here on the prairie. And working with the Blackfoot Confederacy on a native trout restoration project or native trout recovery project. So just looking at West Slope cutthroat and bull trout in the Bow and Old Man watersheds. So yeah, there's a lot of things going on. So, you know, we just want to do better in terms of knowing what we've got here on our current reserve lands and in Blackfoot territory, to just make sure we're monitoring some of those species a little better and making sure no more disappear.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. You guys you're definitely busy, eh?
Elliot, we just have a quick question from Leslie. is the timberland in your timber limit in Waterton?
It's actually, so when you go, if you know Waterton, you take the Chief Mountain Parkway. So it's the highway, I think it's Highway 6 that goes from Highway 5, you go over the Waterton Valley, and you cross over into the Belly River. And then you make your way up to the Chief Mountain border crossing. So it's in the upper Belly River Valley on your way to Chief Mountain. So we're right in the shadow of Chief Mountain up there. So that's where our land is. Surrounded on 3 sides by Waterton, and on the north by Alberta.
Okay. And I'm gonna save our last question for Jane, actually. Jane, I believe she has a question for you, Elliot.
Yeah, I think this conversation, I'd probably want to chat with you, Elliot, more outside of this because we don't have enough time. But my question, I think it's amazing all the work that you guys are doing. And I was just wondering if you're aware or if KEPA is like part of a network of those similar types of organizations with the other Blackfoot nations. And also whether there would be any ability for myself or others from our program to learn from you when you're conducting any of those prescribed fires as well. I think that there's lots to share either way, and I was just wondering if there would be any of those types of opportunities in the future.
Oh yeah, for sure, Jane. You'd be welcome to join us in any of the work that we're doing. Yeah, we're actually looking to Parks Canada, Waterton, and some of the fire people there in assisting us in developing the prescribed burn on our timber area, and also working with Alberta Environment and Parks Canada to for some of the prescribed burns we may do on our main reserve. So yeah, like you guys are the experts, so we're certainly looking for your assistance. So yeah, you'd be welcome to come down anytime. And we're doing some work in the Bow, the trout recovery project. So we may be up in your neck of the woods next year if we get more funding. But yeah, I'll certainly pop in and say hi if I'm up there.
Yeah, for sure. If I can get your email, that we have a prescribed fire kind of intro course thing that you might be interested in joining, just to learn a little bit of what our processes are and stuff. I can send you the info. It's in January.
Okay, no, that would be great for sure. Me and some of our group would be really interested in that. Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Awesome. Okay, well, it's 11:33, so we are a little bit over our time. So I'm going to wrap us up. But on behalf of everyone who is part of the Fire with Fire initiative, I want to extend a huge thank you to Jane Park. Your presentation was amazing. I'm looking forward to connecting with you again in the future to seeing how our initiative can line up with some of the work that you're doing. Definitely am excited to learn more from you. Mike is no longer on the call, but I do want to extend a big thank you to our elder, Mike Brucehead, today for his blessing and his teachings and sharing of his knowledge. Elliot, thank you for being a good sport and being put on the spot and answering some questions. And yeah, overall, just thank you all for joining us today. I've shared Mike Brucehead's email with you all in the chat box, but it is chiefbird@hotmail.com. If there's anyone else that you want to connect with, I know you've been sort of receiving emails from the webinar, so feel free to respond to those emails and we can make connections and share information and resources and create a little network. This is likely going to be our last webinar in the Keeping the Fire Burning webinar series. So thank you for everyone who has been with us from the beginning, who joined us today, who's joined, anywhere from 1 to 6 of the webinars. It's been a lot of fun. But yeah, enjoy the time off over the holidays. Stay safe out there. And I'm sure we will all connect again at some point in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Have a
everyone.
good one.
Thank you.